Hey YouTube, hey viewers, and welcome back to yet another episode of creating our little social media API using Laravel. We've got quite far in the series. I mean, we've made controllers and we've got Postman up and running so we can do get and post requests and just a few bits and pieces. This is just obviously all beginner stuff at the moment, and we'll soon start working our way into the tutorial. But I want to just show you some fundamentals first before we just jump in there, so at least you understand what I'm doing and why we're doing it. So before we get started, I just want to let you know that we now have this join button. If you're not subscribed yet, please make sure you hit the subscribe button. It's just here as well. I'm obviously logged into my account, so I can't see it. But there's also this join one where you can support me. It's got a little bit of a video there if you haven't seen this one already. It's pretty much the same one. I had to make one, so I'm not too sure why. You'll notice that there's different attributes. So node level 1, level 2, and level 3. Each one has its own perks. You can read about it below. This one is probably the best one, so maybe check that one out. For those people that might be struggling, this might be something you might want to look at in regards to a membership perk, I guess. The longer you stay, you get this cool little loyalty badge. I'm not the best artist in the world, but I thought I'd just make these. So this is when you're new: 1 month, 2 month, 6 month, 12 month, and 24 month. So anyways, I'm going to finish plugging that in and we'll just get straight into the tutorial. So where we left off last was we created this test controller. Now remember, the test controller came from our API route. So when we made these routes, we could call a specific URI, so in this case, hello world. And this was using a get or post method. And we pointed it towards a controller, which then called one of our functions within inside the controller. So remember, we have this test controller here. Now, what we're going to look at today is we're going to look at replacing this request. So because this request pulls everything, so everything from the form, so what we have in Postman here, it grabs all that data, so we know first name, last name, and age, and then it does, obviously we get a return back from that. So what we're going to look at today is replacing this, but in a different method that you might be used to of reading documentation. And I'll show you the difference between them. So what we're going to look at is this thing called validation of data coming in to our request. Now, it sounds very complicated, but what we're going to be doing is we're going to be checking against each one of these fields to see if, for example, is this text? Is it meant to be numbers? How long should it be? How short should it be? There's loads of different things that we can do with these requests. And we can make sure that before we even get anywhere further into the controller, so any of this logic down here, we always make sure we do the check first. And that's always good, because remember in the beginning I said to you, controllers need to be as thin as possible. You don't want them to do any of this logic. We've only put this logic in here for this test purpose. You'll notice as soon as we get further into the tutorial, these will be very short. We're probably talking maybe about this many lines, but then when you get to the actual part of the logic section, you'll see there's a lot more detail in there. But just for this example, we're just using this controller just to do some logic. So how do we do that? So what we need to do is we need to check against this request. So we need to check what's coming in the request and how do we fill some data with inside that request. Now to do that, we use the thing called a validator. Now, this way is the way I don't like it, because you're making it inside the controller and I don't like putting things in controllers. But you can do this. Validation. So this can be a variable, it could be whatever. It doesn't really matter what you could do. Actually, let's just call it validate data in this instance. And then we're going to grab the request. So we want the request. And then we're going to use some Laravel logic. And we're going to call it validate with bag. So basically, validate with bag just puts it in a little container of what we want to look at. So again, this is dependent if you want to do it. I don't like doing it this way, but you're more than welcome if it's easier for you. And you give it a name, so it's basically a pouch of errors that we want to keep them in. So let's just call this post in this instance. Again, doesn't really matter what you call it. You can call it whatever you like. And then we need to pass it an array of information. Sorry, wrong brackets. So I want to pass it an array. And inside that array, the first thing we want to pass is first name. So first name, so this one here. So what we're getting from the request, so first name. And we need to pass in some things that we want to check against first name to see if they're correct. So if we go back to our data, we can see we've got these field names. So first name, last name, and age. First name is obviously a string, last name's a string, and age is an integer. So we could check against these things. But we can also say, well, these are also needed. They can't be blank. So what we can do is we can say Well, we want first name to be required because we need it. And we also want to make sure that it's a string. So remember, see, I'm just comma separating in the array. We can also do things like it needs to be a minimum of 1 character long. So it needs to be required. And there's many more different features that we can have here. We don't have to be very specific on just that. And then we can do the next one. So remember PHP Storm, which is Control D. We're going to use last name for the next one. And we're going to do the same. So it needs to be required, needs to be a string, and a minimum of 1. And then the last one we're going to put in is our age. So age can come into here. It's going to be required. This time it's not a string, it's actually an integer. And we're not really too bothered if it's a minimum of 1 or not. And then just need to close that off. I put a full stop here, that's why it's shouting at me. It needs to be a comma. Format the code so we can see that we've got the request. So this is what's being passed in here. We're validating with the bag. There's different ways to validate. You can check the documentation if you like. This is just the way. If I was doing it this way, I prefer to do it this way. We have a bag of errors. In this case, it's called post. And then we have the first name, which needs to be required, string and a minimum of 1. Last name required, string, minimum of 2. Age required, an integer. This is just checking against the form data. And really what should happen if we make anything incorrect here, we should get an error. So let's go into our postman. First thing we need to check is our headers. Because we're using JSON, we need to make sure that we have these on. If you don't, please make sure you've got them. It's always handy to have it. So just make sure you have in your headers except as application JSON. Same here with application JSON. I'll show you what happens if they're not. So let's turn it off actually. I'll just untick them. And let's make an error. So let's take first name out completely. So it's just blank field. Hit the send button. And you notice it'll just redirect me back to the Laravel page. This is not what you want to show the end user. This is completely incorrect. And that's because we don't have those headers in. So once you put the headers in and press send, we get a nice little error message back saying the given data was invalid, and it gives us an error list of what was invalid. So in this case, the first name field is required. So if we go back and we put some data in here, so we just call myself Wayne again. We take the last name, take that out, hit the send button, does the same again. If I try to put a number in, it should tell us, oh, that's actually worked for some reason. We need to check out why that's happening. And then the same for age. So obviously age is now a number. But this is not a way how I like doing validation, because Laravel has got its own request tool that we have. We can use that. And to do that, we're going to jump into our console. Let me just zoom in because you guys liked it when I zoomed it in. And inside our project, you can see I'm inside here. If we do PHP Artisan, you'll notice in our PHP Artisan, we have some make stuff. Now, remember I told you we're going to use a lot of these make commands. And inside there, we've got, if you go down, we should have something called request. And here it is here. So we've got this request. And basically, this is going to make a new form request class for us. Now, this is pretty cool because every request we can do, we can make its own little form, which we can use over and over again if we want to, if it needs the same data. Or we can make individual ones for each request. Now, I like doing that because obviously it splits my code up. Again, it's up to you how you want to do it. If you want to do it this way, which is the ugly way, I would never suggest doing this. I don't like this way. You can do it that way if you want. I mean, preference is preference, but I always like keeping my controllers nice and small. So let's make one. So let's go into here, and we want to use this make request. So we're just going to copy that, and we're going to type in PHP Artisan. I'm just going to paste that in. So make request, and we're going to give it a name. So we're going to camel case it, and we're just going to call it test post controller. Okay, so it's all camel cased. Press enter and it says request created successfully. So where is that? So let's jump into our code base and let's have a look. So if we scroll around, you'll see that we've now got this folder called in the HTTP directory called requests. If we open that up, we've now got this test post controller, and you can see we've got a bit of data here from a form request. Now this is pretty cool because we don't really need to do a lot of work here. We can just put in the things that we require for these requests. So the same thing that we kind of did in the controller with the first name, last name, and then we passed in some parameters, we can do the same here. So let's try. So in here, we're just going to do first name because that's one of our parameters, first name. And we're just going to make sure that we can check against some properties. So in this case, we're going to have a string. Required. Notice I'm pipelining this now, not making it into multiple arrays. And let's just say minimum of 1. Okay. Comma duplicate. And we're going to have last name. Last name. Again, we're just going to keep the same. So we'll duplicate that. And the last one we want is age, which is not a string, it's an integer. And it is required. And it's minimum. We can take the minimum out, actually. We don't need that. So basically, these pipelines are just saying or. So it has to be a string, or it's required, or it needs to be minimum 1. Last name needs to be a string, required, minimum, blah, blah, blah. Okay, save that. Let's go into our controller. Now, remember we called this test post controller. Actually, I've made a mistake, guys. You should, at the end of it, always put request at the end of it. It's probably best. So let's just rename this. So refactor, rename, request. It's always best to give it a name of request at the end, I find. Sorry, that was my error. So when you're in your console here, just instead of test post controller, make sure you call it test post controller request. Sorry. So now we want to use this request, so we can copy its name. Well, we don't actually copy it because in PHP Storm it types in for us. So instead of request, we're going to call it test post controller request and press enter. Now, I'm a bit of a neat freak. I like to make sure these are all lined up from smallest to biggest. Some people hate me for doing that, but that's just how it is. And we can take out this code now. So you can see that our controller is becoming a lot more thinner. We don't have all that data in it, which is nice and cool. And now it's going to do a check first into our request here. It's going to check these first before we run anything inside the controller. I just find it a lot more cleaner. So let's go into Postman. Let's run this. So we hit send. We are unauthorized, so let's just have a look. Why are we unauthorized? Oh, because we need to set this to true. Run that again. Okay, so you can see that that's working. It says Wayne Fellows 90. If we take this out and press send, we get the error message. So we can see we get more than one error message now. So this is another reason why I use it. So we get the given data was invalid, and it actually gives us everything that was invalid. So this is nice for our front-end devs, that they can get a whole list of errors that they can show to the end user. So let's try to put a number in and hit send. It still works again. I need to find out why that's being very specific. I think string's probably not the right word for it, so I'll have to check and see in the docs. But we'll just go again and just put Wayne inside there. Actually, let's just put one letter in. That should work. And obviously, when you set to a minimum of 1. Take out the surname, hit send, and you can see it does exactly the same thing. If I take both of them out, you can see that it starts making an array of errors. And if we take this one out as well and hit send, it gives us every single error, and we need all of those fields. If I put in some extra field into here and then send the request off, obviously which wasn't required, we can then get that data. And then obviously once we have all that data in correctly, so Wayne Fellows at 90, hit the send key. Obviously, our print is the Wayne Fellows of 90. So if we go back into our code base, into our controller. So this is saying request, which is right. So we get the request of the first name, the request of the last name, request of the age, and then we get a return of first name, last name, and age is what we're getting back. So a nice, easy session, to be honest. This was a very short lesson, but hopefully it gives you a good idea about making requests. This is going to be very important for us when we move into our next set of episodes. We're going to kind of move away now from this test controller, where we were just testing a few functionalities of just basic theory that we want to use for the API. So hopefully you enjoyed that. Remember, if you like the video, make sure you hit the like button. If you really like it, then obviously subscribe. I mean, that's perfect. But even better, if you could just share it with all your friends, that would be great too. It's been great taking you for this session. I hope you see you in the next one. Goodbye.